What is an acceptable floor for this Giants team in 2025? Who's going to be the fifth starter? And what's the opening day lineup going to be? We're going to get into all of that next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, hosting this show for almost 6 full years, going on year 7, and I'm a lifelong Giants fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please just hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. And coming up on today's show, as promised, finally, we're going to be doing our mailbag episode. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions on Twitter, on YouTube, and on Blue Sky. The first question comes from Ryan, who says, what is an acceptable floor for the Giants this year? Making the playoffs, a playoff run, or I've got the word betting in young talent, getting in young talent, like Eldridge / Harrison / Birdsong for the long term, regardless of making the playoffs. So it's a good question. And I think it depends on who you ask. You know, some people might say one thing and I might say another. And so for me, because of course I can only answer for myself, I think that it would be acceptable if they had a season in which they did not make the playoffs, simply because, I mean, I'm not saying it's like actually acceptable to not make the playoffs as often as they have not made the playoffs since winning the World Series in 2014. They made it in 2016 and 2021, and that's it. Right? That's it. And both division series losses. So it's been a while. If you're a youngster, if you're 18 or whatever, like you haven't seen this team have a lot of success, you know, since you were very, very young. So anyway, those of us who are a little older, we remember the glory days of 10, 12, and 14, but now you got to say stuff like that, like you're a little older, to remember that. So anyway, obviously, it would be disappointing to miss the playoffs. I think if they make the playoffs, it's hard to say it's unacceptable. Like, it would be a positive turn, and some good things would have happened for them to do it. A playoff run, obviously, is acceptable, but the young talent thing, like, I think that is key, and it's beyond necessarily just the guys you mentioned, Eldridge, Harrison, Birdsong. There's a lot of guys, and I want to see, can Heliot Ramos continue to build upon his breakout season? What about Tyler Fitzgerald? And what about Marco Luciano or Luis Matos and Casey Schmidt? And then a lot of young pitching, including Harrison and Birdsong, but also Landon Roop and some of the other guys who we haven't seen debut yet, but are on the 40-man roster. What about Carson Wisenhunt and, you know, Tristan Beck and some bullpen guys and Willy Adames' first season with the Giants. So, but the young players, if they can have, like, I don't know, one of Heliot Ramos or Tyler Fitzgerald just like really establish themselves and prove that last year wasn't a fluke, plus have a few other like breakouts out of all those young players I mentioned who are all on the doorstep of the major leagues or already kind of in the major leagues, then and make it really look like there's positive momentum going into 2026, then I personally would be okay with that. But at the end of the day, I mean, it would be real nice if they could make the playoffs, just kind of, even if it takes a little overperformance, just getting in. I would obviously be disappointed if it was a short playoff run if they did make the playoffs. But I really believe the playoffs are largely a crapshoot. And so if you get in, any team is capable of going on a run and at least winning some series. Not necessarily, it's hard to win the whole thing, but even if you're an underdog, like 2 years ago, people talking about the Dodgers are unstoppable. 2 years ago, the Diamondbacks won 84 games and they swept the Dodgers in the division series. So that's just an example of, it was an 84 win Diamondback team and the Dodgers won a lot more than that. So anyway, I'd be okay, but if none of that stuff happens, then that's unacceptable. Like that, and what does unacceptable mean? It just means I would be frustrated beyond belief, and so would the majority of fans. Although there's no scapegoat now in the front office, people are going to give Buster Posey a grace period, just like even to some extent Farhan Zaidi got a grace period. So I think in that case, frustration would turn more towards ownership and payroll and stuff like that, as opposed to towards Buster Posey himself. So anyway, good question. And moving on, City P asks, any chance that if Harrison loses the 5th spot to Birdsong or Roop, we might see him as a second lefty in the pen? In his rookie season, he was able to dial up the velocity, and I'd trust him more than Joey Lucchesi. Plus, he could get more reps that way. And so there's another question. I'm kind of going to actually mix them in here from Brendan Cross, who says, do you think the Giants would break camp with just one lefty, Eric Miller, out of the pen, or will they most likely have multiple lefties on the roster on opening day? So I would imagine they probably have multiple lefties, but I wouldn't guarantee it, because I've heard somebody like Bob Melvin or something say that they do think they have righties who can get lefties out, and so they're not so concerned about necessarily having multiple lefties. But your idea is definitely worth looking at here, because Harrison, I think he pitched today and gave up a lot of runs and got very few outs. I don't think he struck anybody out. So it's spring, but you look at guys like Landon Roop, who have just been very, very impressive, and Hayden Birdsong at times last year was very impressive. So I would not guarantee that it's going to be Kyle Harrison being that 5th starter at all. And if he's not, I think that it's a intriguing idea to have him pitching out of the bullpen. Again, not necessarily long term. I didn't mention that. But what I think about is like last year and in recent years, they've had starting caliber players pitching out of the bullpen. And that was one of the reasons they traded Taylor Rogers, was to create another opening in the bullpen for young pitching. Was kind of I feel like somebody said that, whether it was Posey or somebody else, but they just have a lot of young pitchers, like you mentioned, with Harrison and Birdsong and Roop, just to name those 3. And I could go on and on. Sean Jelly, Tristan Beck, and others. There's like a ton of others even who are all on the 40-man, like Keaton Wynn, Trevor McDonald, Carson Seymour, Carson Ragsdale, Mason Black, and then Carson Wisenhunt. He's not even on the 40-man, but I would throw him in there too. And so you can utilize that bullpen for guys like Kyle Harrison and just let him, in a game where your starter gets taken out early, let him just pitch 4 innings or whatever out of the pen. And if you dominate in that role, then you get moved back into the pen. It's kind of fluid. And yeah, if he doesn't win the spot, I don't see him necessarily going to AAA, although that could be something they do as well if they wanted him to make consistent starts and work on something. So anyway, coming up in just a minute, we have way more to get to, including my prediction for the opening day lineup. If everyone is healthy, what is that lineup going to be? Are we going to have another new left fielder? I think for sure we are. Oh my goodness. How many years in a row is that? We'll get into it in just a minute. And before we do, Today's episode of Locked on Giants is brought to you in part by wonderful pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with wonderful pistachios. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see I've got some right here with me right now. Wonderful pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the shelled variety. It's the perfect grab and go snack for busy days, whether I'm snacking at my desk on a road trip or I just need a quick protein boost. They're always my go-to. I just like cracking them open, and yeah, these are roasted and salted, just delicious. I love cracking open that shell, that satisfying crunch, and the in-shell or the no shells variety is a classic as well. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. All right, here we go. It's going to be opening day lineup prediction time. Thanks again for making Locked on Giants your first listen every day. Everydayers, coming up tomorrow, I'm going to be having a conversation with Millard from Locked on D-backs. Always a fun time talking with Millard, and that'll be coming at you tomorrow. And then probably on Friday, more mailbag questions. We got a lot given. We got people calling in from Twitter, YouTube, and Blue Sky. So anyway, yes, moving along. The next question comes from Toby, who says, what's the lineup going into opening day if everyone is healthy? So I'm trying to remember. This wasn't the question, so maybe I shouldn't spend time trying to remember who the opening day left fielder was last year. It wasn't Heliot Ramos, but right now he lines up to be the guy. And so was it Michael Conforto or something like that? So it's like another year, yeah, you're going to have another left fielder, but maybe Heliot Ramos is the guy who breaks the streak. He definitely could be, because right now it's going to be him, assuming health, and it could be him for years to come. So one of the questions that we're not going to get to today is about Lamont Wade Jr. and how he can't hit leadoff. Well, he can and he will hit leadoff, I think, on opening day. Well, who are they facing? They're facing on opening day the Cincinnati Reds, and the Cincinnati Reds are not going to start a lefty. So that matters, right? It matters not that you're going to platoon everywhere in your lineup, but it affects your lineup. Yeah, so they're going to start probably Hunter Green. So you're going to be facing a hard-throwing righty on opening day, most likely, assuming health for their team as well. So yeah, I think Lamont Wade Jr. will start at first base and hit leadoff. Batting second, and I'm basing this partially on comments that Bob Melvin has made about the lineup and what he likes. And I also made my own lineup prediction months ago, and some people gave me heat for some of the guys I had in certain places, and that's exactly what Melvin has said he envisions doing. So just FYI. Willy Adames batting second. Most teams put their kind of best hitter batting second these days, not your like contact, move the runner over type hitter. And for leadoff, on base percentage is what's really important, not stealing bases per se. Generally, that's the analytical point of view. So Willy Adames, shortstop, batting second. Jung Hoo Lee, this is where there was some pushback when I threw out that he would bat third, or maybe I was proposing Luis Adames to the Giants in a trade and had him batting third, but the point was he doesn't have enough power to bat third. The same could be said of Jung Hoo Lee as an argument that I wouldn't agree with. It's just about how, like, if you can provide value however you provide value offensively, and it leads to run creation, even if it's not traditional. So yeah, I think Jung Hoo Lee figures to bat third and play center on opening day. And then batting fourth and playing third, Matt Chapman. Feel like he hit fourth almost always last year. And so that's who I would currently have as batting fourth and playing third. And then maybe it gets a little tricky. Like, do you want to do consecutive righties here, or do you want to put in a lefty? But I think Heliot Ramos bats fifth and plays left field, and then Mike Yastrzemski bats sixth and plays right field on opening day. And so the reason someone might say, oh, it should be Tyler Fitzgerald or Encarnación, like that is a question, like who's the DH, right? And we haven't gotten there yet. But you want to break up these righties because many of 5 hitters in a row, 4 of them are righties in my lineup here. And so I got to break them up with Yaz right in the middle. Chapman, Ramos, righties, Yaz, lefty, breaking up those righties, and then 2 more righties coming up. So is it Tyler Fitzgerald batting 7th and playing second base, or is it Jerar Encarnación batting 7th and DHing? I think one of those two. Flip a coin. Maybe Bob Melvin goes with the give the respect to the younger player to the player who played more last year and proved that he was deserving of being in a major league lineup and hitting somewhat high-ish in the lineup, not last or whatever. So I'll go with Tyler Fitzgerald batting 7th and playing second, and then Jerar Encarnación being the DH and batting 8th. Some people might say, what? Your DH is batting 8th? That means you have a horrible lineup. I would push back on that and say most teams don't have a dedicated DH, and it's just guys that get rotated through the spot. And so you'll see across the league, plenty of teams, their DH is not necessarily the guy batting in like 4th or 3rd or whatever. So it's not that unusual. And then Patrick Bailey batting 9th and catching. And so gives me an opportunity to go on a somewhat small tangent where I just want to point out these early comparisons that were made of Patrick Bailey to Buster Posey. I said immediately I thought they were really unfair and probably not accurate. It takes a lot to be Buster Posey, Hall of Fame player, easily, in my opinion. Impact hitter and good defensively, whereas I was saying immediately that Bailey reminded me of Yadier Molina, where it was like, yeah, you'll take what you can get offensively, but it's just such an impact defensive player. Bailey's not the best blocker, but he does everything else well, and blocking is the least important defensive thing a catcher does. Their framing is by far the most important, and he's the best framer in baseball, and he's a good thrower, like pop times in terms of his quickness from when ball hits the glove to when it gets to second base, and the speed with which he makes his throws and the accuracy. So anyway, I'm going on it. That was a tangent, but you could, because Bailey's a switch hitter, you could break up the righties a little bit more and have Bailey higher up and have Fitzgerald batting 9th or something. But generally, those are the guys. Like, I would expect those to be the 9 guys, and there's not really a lot of controversy, especially if there's a righty starter. If it was a lefty starter, then you may not see Wade, you may not see Yastrzemski, but otherwise, I think you see everybody else that was mentioned. And just to be clear, I think Flores would take the place of Wade. If it was a lefty, not necessarily not batting first, I think it would switch things around. And then if it was a lefty, I think you might see Luis Matos on this team and platooning with Mike Yastrzemski. And as I discussed yesterday, not saying Luis Matos is going to be cornered into the platoon role. It's more like a way to have success, and then naturally you start a game against a lefty, and then the lefty comes out, and then you don't get taken out of the game if you're winning or losing by 4 or 5 runs. You keep playing and you face some righties, and then if you do well in those at-bats, you earn some more at-bats against righties, and then that's how it happens, and that's how you become an everyday player. So I just want to be clear about that just because you're like 23 years old and getting platooned doesn't mean you will always be platooned. And I don't think, like, there's so many guys on the Giants who that would be the case for, like Matos, Luciano. Like, they're just not, they don't want them to fail, and so they want to set them up for success, and then proving it would give them more playing time. So I think the harder question is, what is the bench going to be? Then what is the lineup going to be? But that's the one I've got. And moving on, we will get to a question about Encarnación and his defense. Is he just a DH or can he play other defensive positions? And then we'll get into Luis Matos and can he steal that right field job from Mike Yastrzemski? So we'll get into all of that in just a minute. And before we do, all right, here we go. We're going to get to more questions and answers. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Everydayers coming up tomorrow. We're going to be talking with Millard from Locked On D-backs. We'll definitely get into the Corbin Burns situation, all those quotes I was reading the other day or yesterday about how the D-backs players thought he was going to the Giants. And so Millard will be doing a victory lap on that one. And we'll be breaking down the NL West landscape. Probably making some predictions, maybe making a friendly wager, which we've done in the past, about how this season will play out, which team will finish ahead of the other. The D-backs probably have the edge there, but so I gotta handicap it a little bit if I'm gonna. Yeah, that's not gonna be fair. We'll work something out, and you'll hear it tomorrow. So moving along, Bobby says, besides DH, how capable is Jerar Encarnación at first base? Do you think, this is a separate question from Bobby, do you think we get a Yaz Matos platoon in right plus Matos as a utility player for all outfield positions? So I'll answer both of those questions. So Encarnación, we can simply look back at his defensive career in ideally the major leagues. So he has spent a grand total of 13 innings at first base in his major league career out of, I'd have to do some math here. It looks like he's played roughly 600, a little less than 600 total innings in the major leagues, 13 innings at first, by far the position of the positions he's played the least. He's played left field 113 innings, right field 166. And so we just simply, I don't have enough to go off of for how he would do as a first baseman. He has played not that many innings at first base in the minor leagues either, whereas he played a lot of right field. So right field has been his primary position. He's not DH'd that much. If you look at the minor leagues and if you look at on the Giants last year, he DH'd 16 times. He played the outfield 18 times, and he played first twice. So they primarily used him in the field rather than DH, although it was close to an even split. So I don't think they view him as a first baseman, but what's worth pointing out is that he was surprisingly competent in the outfield. Kind of reminds me of the story of Darren Ruff, how he was surprisingly competent in the outfield until he wasn't. He was, when the Giants were having success, 2021, he did well out there, but then it caught up with them when they had that awful defensive year. I think it was 2022, and Darren Ruff fumbling around out there was a big part of it. But in his major league career, just 279 and a third innings in the outfield, but 2 defensive runs saved, 0 outs above average. So that's competent, but it's also not enough of a sample for me to trust. But from what I saw last year, he looked competent out there, competent. I'm not saying great, but it would add value to him for sure if he could play some outfield. And so your question about Luis Matos, perhaps Encarnación, if Matos struggles, could become an option to play some outfield and, hit against lefties when there's a lefty on the mound and instead of having Yaz out there, something like that. And then, of course, there's always injuries. But to answer your question about Matos, I do think to start the year, I do think you do probably get a Yaz and Matos platoon with the hope of Matos taking over. That would be my thinking. I don't think that they want Matos to be playing center field. I think they'd rather have Yaz play center field. Matos really proved, even in the corners, to be somewhat of a liability, but especially in center, it was all bad. And so I don't think Matos is that second string center fielder. But yeah, he could play left in the event of an injury or an off day to Heliot Ramos. So yeah, I see Matos, not a guarantee at all, but they did option Marco Luciano today, so it's not going to be Luciano in that kind of role. Luciano's new to the outfield, so I think they want him to get just consistent work, including in the minors in the outfield. But I think Matos has done enough in AAA to kind of warrant, it's kind of sink or swim time, and at the major league level. So next question comes from Armchair Fantasy Sports, who's also known as Danny, who says, is Yaz penciled in at right field, or do you think Matos can force the Giants to make him the starting right fielder with a great spring? Still a possibility of a Yaz trade if that happens. So this is an intriguing question to me. I think it's unlikely because it's really unwise probably to put too much weight into spring training performance. I suppose if he just absolutely just kills the ball, and I think these days teams have like models that they use that are affected by spring training performance, and it's more about like maybe the StatCast data versus the actual results. But Matos has had 24 spring plate appearances, and he has not struck out. He's also not walked. So interesting spring for Matos so far. Just a little bit above average offensively, 103 weighted runs created plus. Thankfully, Fangraphs now lists spring training results. Yaz has struck out 43% of the time in just 14 plate appearances. But established major leaguer, I doubt it. I don't think they want to just make that gamble. I think they'd rather do what I said, which is let Matos prove it before they make a move like that. So I don't think so. Anyway, next question from Matthew, who says, what's the plan for fringe 40-man roster guys like David VR, one option year left? I believe it's 0. I'm going to double check when you say one option year. I think he has none. Brett Wisely, 2 option years, and Wade Meckler, 1 option year. Any predictions on what happens to them this year? And so, yes, first I will just confirm that David VR is, in fact, out of minor league options. According to Roster Resource, he is. There was even an article on MLB Trade Rumors this morning that got into David VR, of all people, and how he was out of options. And it referenced, I think, Alex Pavlovich writing about how VR was not so much trying to showcase himself for the Giants, but for the 29 other teams this spring. So I foresee that David VR, who plays third base primarily, is just not going to be on the Giants not going to be in the Giants organization within a week of opening day, because he may be DFA'd close to opening day. I think if they want to do him a solid, they would move him at any point for whatever they can get for him moving forward, because he has to be in the major leagues. Otherwise, they have to DFA him. And he could be DFA'd and go unclaimed and then end up getting outrighted to the minor leagues, like with basically off the 40-man and sent to the minors. You can get outrighted once in your career, and I don't believe he's been outrighted before. There's no reason he would be if he still had an option left, which he did until now. So anyway, I think VR is either outrighted to the minors or claimed off waivers or traded. And Brett Wisely, I think there's a shot that he makes the opening day roster as kind of that utility player who can play short, he can play second, he could play third. I think he's played all those. I think he's also played the outfield. Last year, 50 games at second, 37 at short, 3 at third, 1 at first, and 1 in center. So he's shown some versatility, but I think we're off by a year here, because I see him as having 1 option year remaining, but there's a chance he's on the opening day roster. But given that he has a minor league option, he could also be sent to the minors, and it could be somebody else like Casey Schmidt. So he's another like fringe guy. And Oslavis Basabe is another guy who has one option remaining. Right-handed hitter, can play multiple infield positions. So there really is a battle for that kind of role that would be filled by either Wisely or Schmidt or Basabe. And I don't think it would be David Villar. And other than that, who else is really in play? Those are the main guys. I think one of those three probably makes the team in that role. Oh, there is also Christian Cusp, but he's not on the 40-man, so there's no pressure to add him to it. So I don't think it's him out of spring, but it's a different regime, different way they may operate. So maybe Christian Cusp, who's been really impressive defensively at a premium position like shortstop, perhaps they just go, he's the best guy, and they add him and he makes the team. So there's a real battle there for like backup infield. And you mentioned Wade Meckler. I think he doesn't start the season on the team, but he's a guy who very well may get playing time at the major league level this year. He does have one option year remaining. We're aligned on that in terms of our numbers. So I don't think he starts the season in the majors unless there's an injury to Jung Hoo Lee or Mike Yastrzemski. Even then, it could be somebody else instead of him. But I think we see him this year, and then he gets some looks because it's his last option year. So they need to find out what they have. Otherwise, he ends up in that no options situation like David Villar going into next spring, and then he has to be in the major leagues or else you have to DFA him or trade him. And so they need to find out, these guys with one option year left, they need to find out this year what they have in these players. And that's part of what makes this year exciting to me, is that there's incentive for them to play these guys, Marco Luciano among them, Casey Schmidt, like a lot, to figure out what they have. So the final question, I might run through it really fast. Marshall says, what are the realistic expectations for the bullpen? Lots of talk about the starting rotation with boom or bust question marks like Robbie Ray, Jordan Hicks, Kyle Harrison, but not much about the pen. Is there hope for Camilo Doval returning to form? Can Sean Jelly continue to improve and be a solid innings-eating reliever? So I think the main reason you don't hear much about the bullpen is because it's quite settled and I think pretty good. I think there's a huge chance of Camilo Doval rebounding. I wouldn't wait 1 year that heavily versus all the other years of his career where he's been very good. And so I would expect a rebound for Doval. And I think Ryan Walker, based on what he's done in his major league career, already looks like one of the better relievers around and should be a good closer. Tyler Rogers is very good and underrated. And then they've got all this flexibility where they can use these young pitchers, like maybe it's Kyle Harrison or Landon Roop or Hayden Birdsong or Tristan Beck. And whoever's performing, they can use their Sean Jelly and Randy Rodriguez. And then they've got some non-roster guys potentially in the mix, like Lou Trevino and Joey Lucchesi. But I like the idea of using some of the younger guys with more upside more. But I think that's why you don't hear much, is because it's a pretty solid looking group and one of the probably strengths of the team. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On Fantasy Baseball podcasts with hosts Dominic Martino and Matthew Anay. MLB fantasy draft season is here, and be the most informed fan and set yourself up for a league win. Locked On Fantasy Baseball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts is available for you. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter /X at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. Helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance. Thanks to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.